Daniel Cross Turner, and I'm head of programming and outreach for the Georgetown County Library System. And welcome to the library's series of online programs celebrating South Carolina's deep and diverse food traditions, entitled From Blue Hills to Green Sea, representing South Carolina foodways. These programs are generously sponsored by South Carolina Humanities, as well as our friends of the Georgetown Library and friends of the Waccamaw Library. So we're very excited to be featuring all this information about food and cuisine and eating traditions, growing traditions, all the way from the Piedmont, the Blue Hills, down to the coastal plain here, the Green Sea. And thanks for joining us. We have a great slate of foodways experts who are taking us on this adventure. And today we're going to hear from Matthew Dischinger. And Dr. Dischinger is going to tell us all about Jewish foodways in South Carolina. The title of his talk is A Southern Shabbat, Jewish Foodways in South Carolina. Dr. Dischinger is on the Department of English faculty at Georgia State University, and he has co-edited an essay collection titled Southern Comforts, Drinking and the U.S. South from LSU Press in 2020. And this moves beyond stereotypical associations of Southern drinking, moonshiners, outlaws, and teetotalers, and undercuts popular myths about alcohol in the South. Right? And today's talk, A Southern Shabbat, Jewish Foodways in South Carolina, will turn attention to an often ignored section of the South Carolina population to discuss how Jewish traditions of eating and drinking help us understand the shifting foundations of Southern foodways. Dr. Dischinger's discussion is informed by his participation in the National Endowment for the Humanities Summer Institute down in Charleston, which was called Privilege and Prejudice, Jewish History in the American South. So enjoy Dr. Matthew Dischinger and his talk right now.
Hi everyone, my name is Matthew Dischinger and I am on the faculty of the Department of English at Georgia State University in downtown Atlanta. And I'm going to be talking with you today about Southern Jewish foodways. Before I do, I want to say thanks to Dan Turner and the Georgetown County Library for having me and for including me as a part of this really exciting event. And I also want to mention the image that you can see in the lower right-hand corner is the cover of my book, an edited collection entitled Southern Comforts, Drinking and the U.S. South, which I edited with Connor Pickin. That book came out from LSU Press in March 2020, when the world changed for all of us. And if there are ideas for my talk, which of course is mostly about food, that you're curious about, or if you'd like to learn more about my book, please drop me an email at the email address you can see on this opening screen. Okay, let's get started. The title of my talk is A Southern Shabbat, Jewish Foodways in South Carolina. So I want to start with an image of a Jewish Seder, which is a feast marking the beginning of Passover. And this photo was taken in Charleston, South Carolina in 1904. The photo is from the family of Hyman and Edie Pearlstein, a prominent Jewish family in Charleston. So I want to ask, what do we see when we look at this photograph? To a scholar of Southern studies, and that's me, I see what appears to be a pretty familiar scene, a wealthy white family sitting down to be served by black servants. A son wearing a Confederate uniform sits near the head of the table, and while he's not the center of the photograph, most of the people in the photograph face him, and he faces the photographer. All of this is to say that what we see here is notable for what it centers, and the fact that that is somewhat expected in a photograph taken from Charleston, South Carolina, near the turn of the 20th century, when that photograph is of a wealthy white family marking a special occasion with a meal. What makes the photograph more interesting, of course, is that the family is Jewish. The fact that there is a seeming incongruity between the Old South and the Jewish diaspora is a big part of my talk today, and it's where I want us to start, by understanding why we have that incongruity, why we think about it as an incongruity perhaps, but why we shouldn't. Okay, so another quick word about how I arrived here. I came to this work through an NEH Institute. The National Endowment for the Humanities puts on summer institutes and seminars for teachers in K through 12 education as well as in higher education. And the subject of the institute I attended in summer 2019 was Jews in the South. The title was Privilege and Prejudice: Jewish Roots on Southern Soil. It was hosted at the College of Charleston in, like I said, the summer of 2019. And during our 2 weeks together, we read decades of work dedicated to examining the histories and experiences of Jews living in the American South, focusing our work on the Jewish communities in and around Charleston. We read and discussed work about Jewish migration from other parts of the United States and the globe. We discussed the often central roles that Jews played in economic, political, and social the social worlds of Charleston in particular. And then we often returned to questions related to how both of the things I just mentioned, migration and social power, related to how Jews identified themselves and were identified within the usually racialized power structures of the U.S. South. And again, our focus was very often Charleston, in particular, South Carolina, a bit more generally. But what we were really thinking about is how what happened in Charleston was a particular example, but not an exceptional one, within the South writ large, and therefore within the nation. I'm going to get to food, but before I do, I want to briefly recap the direction of our work, which culminated in a meal that I'll discuss momentarily, because by the time we had our Southern Shabbat, which capped the Institute on the last Friday of our 2 weeks together, we had a frame of reference to think about the history of Jews in the South that greatly affected how we digested, that experience. Okay. So one of the things that we kept coming back to in our work was that Jews were not only an integral part of the communities we read about and moved through in Charleston, but also that Jews had arrived in the South much earlier than some might think. In their introduction to the field-defining collection of essays on Jews in the South, entitled Jewish Roots in Southern Soil, Marcy Cohen Ferris and Mark Greenberg write that the first Jewish congregation was established in Charleston in 1749. And that congregation later constructed the synagogue that you see here in this photo. The name of the congregation was Kahal Kadosh Beth Elohim, and KKBE. This is a modern, contemporary picture of KKBE. The synagogue was constructed near the turn of the century in 1794. This is a modern photo of KKBE, as I said, but the thing I want to point out is that even the construction, the founding of this congregation and the construction of the synagogue occurred long after the first Jews arrived in what would become the South, and because that occurred in the 17th century. So just as a frame of reference, for how we should think about Jewish presence in the U.S. South. The Jews who arrived in Charleston were comprised of both Sephardic Jews from the Iberian Peninsula and Ashkenazic Jews, Ashkenazic Jews from Central and Western Europe. There's so much to say about KKBE, but one important thing about KKBE that connects with much of what I want to eventually say about food today is that KKBE was a leader in Reform Judaism in the United States. I've already said this, but my specialization is Southern Studies, and beyond that, Southern Literary and Cultural Studies. I'm not a religious studies scholar, but the thing that I want to impart about Reform Judaism from our work, and something that affects what I want to say today, is that Reform Judaism was often an effort to adapt religious practices to fit with, in the case of KKBE in Charleston, the largely Christian population in which KKBE was located. Liberal Judaism, which is another term that is used somewhat interchangeably with Reform Judaism, is often discussed this way. And when we toured KKBE, we talked a lot about the Greek architecture of the synagogue, which made KKBE resemble other churches and buildings nearby. So from their very foundations in Charleston, and more broadly the South, and even more broadly than that, the United States, Jewish communities were adapting to both fit with and thereby change the broader communities in which they were located. And that model is one that I just want to sit with for a second, that when, because I think we might tend to think about adapting to fit the kind of social practices of a place as conforming to something but not changing it. I think the fact that KKBE, just as one particular example, has been a pillar of the Charleston community, since the middle of the 18th century, illustrates that actually, Jews in Charleston, and as one particular example, were changing and affecting and participating in the community of the South for a long time. Okay, so for a group of scholars interested in the intersections of Jewish and Southern communities, we were confronted by the fact that Jews in the South were often aligned with power structures in the region, most notably slavery and the Confederacy. In these photos that you can see now, we are touring the Cumming Street Cemetery, designated by the National Park Service as, under the National Register of Historic Places, as the oldest Jewish burial ground in the U.S. South. It dates back to 1762. On the photo on the right, you can see the marker for Marks E. Cohen Jr., who lived from 1839 to 1865. And Marks E. Cohen Jr. was a Confederate soldier who was killed near the end of the Civil War. The obelisk, which is a little difficult to see in my photo, which the light's not great here, and I was taking it from the side, so my apologies. But if you look closely at the obelisk, you can see a cannon below the state and Confederate flags of South Carolina and the Confederacy on the obelisk itself. Historian Robert Rosen writes that at the time of the Civil War, between 20 and 25,000 Jews lived in the 11 states that made up the Confederacy. Roughly 2,000 Jews fought with the Confederacy, and records indicate that about 167, pretty precise number, of those servicemen were from South Carolina. And of course, we see evidence of that at the Cumming Street Cemetery, where many of the graves are designated as the graves of those who served with the Confederacy in the Civil War. So what am I driving at here? I'm not really trying to simply make the point that Jews can and have been Southern, and I'm not doing that for a few reasons. For historians, this is a kind of a banal point because it's so obviously true, for all the reasons that I've just sort of briefly explained. Generations of historians have studied Jewish history in the South and produced plenty of work on the subject. And for people in Southern literary and cultural studies, and that's me, being Southern, and that does need to be put in quotes, does not even point toward things that are essentially true or essentially exceptional or essentially distinct about the place that we understand to be the South. Now, instead, the term Southern, again in quotes, Southern, identifies a set of systems and practices, economic systems, social relations, literary genres, cultural productions, and more, all of which are bound together, however tenuously, by this big imagined community that we call the South. In other words, simply stating that Jews can be Southern is, to both groups of scholars, pretty obvious for different but intersecting reasons. The interesting thing to me, then, isn't that Jews can be Southern, but rather what happens with Jewish communities and the imagined community of the South that we all sort of carry with us to varying degrees when those two ideas are brought together. Because there's a lot to say about the effects of ideas like the South, even if we admit that the basic concept of the South is imagined and performed through cultural practices like music, writing, and, well, food. Okay, so what I'm really interested in here today is helping us think through what changes for these ideas when we pay close attention to what Jewish food does in the South and how it intersects with other foodways that I'll discuss here in a moment. Okay, so at the end of our time together, our NEH hosts from the College of Charleston, Sherry Braben, who is now at Oberlin College, seen here blessing the challah, Dale Rosengarten, who's not pictured here, but is at the College of Charleston, and Michael Cohen, also not pictured, but is at Tulane. They hosted a Southern Shabbat to bookend our work at the Institute. And so much of what we'd learned and discussed by that point was illustrated through the meal. As a Gentile, I learned a lot before and during the meal about Shabbat. If you've experienced Shabbat, the sort of point of Shabbat is to set aside time for rest, reflection, something holy, kind of a renewed understanding of time. It begins with the lighting of candles after sunset on Friday and is followed by a celebratory dinner. So that's where we are here, beginning dinner together. And our dinner was not it was very characteristic in the foods that we ate and in its example as a Shabbat, right? It was very characteristic in those ways, but it was not characteristic in that and this made it really fascinating, in that we were given a menu that kind of gave us a lot of information about where our food came from. We heard from three, experienced scholars in foodways before we even sat down to eat, about the same subject, where our food came from and what it was, and how it connected with broader cultures of food that we were sort of bound up in. In other words, when we sat down to eat, we were really eating with an attention to all the things that were brought to bear, all the sort of cultural forces that are brought to bear on food, which of course we'd also talked about and read about in our work for the NEH Institute. So for all those reasons, the point of our meal was to contextualize many of the ideas that I've already brought up, with a particular focus to where I started, how Southern Jews adapted Shabbat in the South, and through that process ended up with food that emerged from many different traditions, most notably African American foodways. For that reason, our meal began with a welcome by Marcy Cohen Ferris, who I've already mentioned and is a giant in the field of Southern foodways and Jewish Southern foodways. Dr. Ferris is the author of Matzo Ball Gumbo, Culinary Tales of the Jewish South, and several other books. Marcy Cohen Ferris introduced the chef who designed and led the preparation for the meal, Kevin Mitchell, who incidentally will be talking about how enslaved cooks in South Carolina transformed Southern foodways tomorrow as a part of this symposium. Mitchell became the first African-American chef instructor at the Culinary Institute of Charleston in 2008. He has a master's degree in Southern Studies from the University of Mississippi, where his thesis focused on the story of African Americans in the region's foodways and culinary professions. So Kevin Mitchell is particularly well suited to position our food for the Southern Shabbat through all this work and contextualize it in all those ways. Finally, Trey Dutton, who you can see Marcy Cohen Ferris and Kevin Mitchell and Trey Dutton in these photos. Trey Dutton, who is the executive catering chef of the College of Charleston, also helped design and prepare our meal. And Dutton has extensive experience in the Charleston restaurant scene, which is, of course, a very vibrant one. And his role in the evening was to use his expertise in rural Southern cooking to inform the preparation and description of our food. So the important thing here is that the meal was sort of intentionally designed with three sources of information: Jewish foodways, African American foodways, and rural Southern foodways. That combination tells us a lot about the mixing and mingling of cultures that we can begin to think about and contextualize through food as this kind of back and forth feedback loop, right? Understanding what the combination of those cultures means and where it comes from, and then actually eating the food and sort of seeing it play out in that way, in that kind of text, if you will. I don't have photos of everything that we ate, but I'm going to include some that help illustrate the cultural currents at work in Southern Jewish foodways. So we began with sweet potato latke topped with trout roe, which is a kind of a South Carolina take on a traditional potato latke with a local equivalent to caviar. Those aren't really pictured here, but I want to say something about them anyway. With the sweet potato latkes, we introduced sweet potatoes, which appear so frequently in Southern cuisine because they were a local equivalent to West African yams that enslaved cooks were familiar with. And so already, right when we begin our meal, we're kind of doing this like Southern Jewish hybrid thing, which of course, because it's Southern, already means that we're talking about the cultural forces that are at work in the South when we define something as Southern food. And very often, and in that case, we're talking about the forces that are connected to the transatlantic slave trade. What you can see in the image here is beet borscht, which is a traditional Eastern European sweet and sour soup. The borscht is topped with bene oil and bene seed, which again you can see in the photo. And again, bene was brought to the United States by enslaved people from Africa. It's a sesame seed staple in low country cooking. So we have these two big categories, Southern and low country, both of which are just the confluence of forces at work in those places. And in both cases, one of the predominant cultural forces that determines what we think of as those spaces' foods at their foundations is slavery. And at the bottom of this photo, we have gefilte fish, which is served in many Jewish homes on the Sabbath. It's typically prepared from a mixture of ground fish, eggs, and bread. And Charleston food writer Hannah Raskin notes that Charleston Jewish families adapted the recipe for their tables since whitefish, carp, and pike weren't typically shipped so far south. Families instead fashioned new recipes using fish from low country waters. And the two gefilte fish you see here are from those recipes. So you see in those moments, and just in this small moment, making gefilte fish from local fish rather than the staples of whitefish, carp, and pike, as an example of Jewish foodways kind of adapting to fit what is available and what works in the South where they are. So even here on this plate, we have dishes that pull together three cultural frameworks: Jewish, African American, and rural Southern. Foodway scholar Michael Twitty writes about what he calls, quote, kosher soul cookery, unquote, as a method and cuisine that begins in the coastal South in areas like Charleston, in which Jewish families enslaved and later employed African American cooks to prepare meals like these. This confluence produces really delicious food. Everything at our Southern Shabbat was outstanding. And at the same time, it's essential to track how and why this food came to exist. And the important thing to note, of course, is that this food kind of exists as a legacy to enslavement. And this is the tricky thing about food. It's not like a monument, right, that can easily be sort of torn down or unpacked. And not only, can it not be torn down, even, for those of us who want to see that happen, it also tastes really good. Consuming food is sort of literally a reparative act through which we are, kind of brought into a sense of wholeness and actual wholeness even. And I think it's the fact that eating food is such a universal delight that makes it especially important and somewhat difficult to approach it with care and attention to history. Food is really interesting to me because of the way it indexes power, but it only does that when we know what we're eating and where it comes from. Okay. And everything I just said is equally true of our main course, which was a whole snapper grilled and served with chimichurri sauce. Once again, the snapper brings together two worlds. It is of the southern Atlantic coast, and the preparation is in keeping with the preparation is in keeping with Jewish traditions of preparing and serving whole fish as the Sabbath's main course. I'm just going to minimize myself so you can see that. It just says whole snapper. While the dish shares more obvious connections to baked redfish and Argentine-inspired dishes, it also shares a connection with two foundational styles of preparing fish in Southern Jewish households. One is the West African style meal that featured a fish dish, served with a vegetable relish or sauce. And the other was adapted by Ashkenazic Jews of Charleston, who Marcy Cohen Ferris describes as, quote, refashioning their Jewish lineage by preparing Iberian-inspired dishes, such as lemon stew, a chilled poached fish course served with lemon-infused sauce. Different as all these dishes may be, we can again entangle our contemporary meal with the history of food preparation in the Jewish community of Charleston and use that entanglement to understand how those different cultures were brought together, what the terms of that bringing together were, and what was really happening when people sat down to eat. We finished our meal with butter seared pound cake, another dish that has roots across the three foundational cultures of food that I've been discussing. Our pound cake included Madeira-infused peaches as a nod to drinking cultures of Low Country, in which Madeira was commonly consumed because it was easy to store and keep. The menu included with our meal, which, as I mentioned at the outset, kind of gave a full accounting of what these foods were and where they came from. I've used it a lot in this presentation. The menu included with our meal notes that pound cake, is of course a staple in African American kitchens, and that the foundational culinary text, and the title of this text is What Miss Fisher Knows About Old Southern Cooking. It has a lot to say about pound cake. That text is authored by Abby Fisher in 1881, a formerly enslaved woman with roots in Orangeburg, South Carolina, who went to Alabama, left Alabama, eventually made her way to South Carolina, or excuse me, not South Carolina, San Francisco. So the dessert, much like the rest of our meal, intersects with the foodways, the cultures of food that emerged from the plantation. So once again, I want to kind of step back and think about what our Southern Shabbat identifies about the intersecting cultures of food and drink that went into our meal. When thinking about Jewish foodways in the South, the experience of eating is both enjoyable and incomplete. And what I mean by that is it's obviously eating provides a kind of sense of enjoyment and even a sense of completeness, right? But it's only through the understanding of history and culture that we come to understand what's happening when we eat, right? So the experience of eating is really kind of what I'm focused on here, is sometimes celebrated in foodways scholarship for itself providing a sort of metaphysical understanding of many of the dynamics I've discussed so far, meaning that it transports us and allows us to understand things about the cultures that we're interacting with that maybe we can't understand in other ways. And on the one hand, why wouldn't it be celebrated for that? For scholars of food, what can be a better experience than actually eating, right? It seems obvious in some ways. Furthermore, as Marcy Cohen Ferris writes in The Edible South, contemporary foodway scholarship very often, quote, foregrounds the once silenced voices of those whose hands and minds have so deeply shaped Southern cuisine. So in other words, I want us to introduce, or I want us to think about these two kind of missions at the same time, to kind of access culture through food and through the actual experience of eating, and then on the other hand, make sure that the voices and hands that have historically and even contemporarily produced that food are given credit, right, and understood for what they've done. And the question I want to leave us with here at the end, though, is does that happen when we eat? Most of our food doesn't arrive to us with a history lesson about the cultures that produce the flavors that we enjoy? Wouldn't it be something, if it did, this meal that we had was accompanied with all that material, lectures, notes about the food. But I want us to think about this question, are we able to access those histories through food? So in an effort to rightfully reposition the dinner table as a potentially reparative space, rather than one that, as this early image I began with makes clear, a space that continues to be the product of familiar power dynamics emanating from the plantation, we may risk reinscribing the myths that we seek to undercut. When we position the dinner table as a reparative space. That's when we risk kind of reinforcing mythologies about the South rather than giving us a particular and attentive understanding of how those mythologies came into being. One such mythology that has come under recent critique in Southern literary and cultural studies is hospitality, Southern hospitality, rather. And that's a concept that Tony Sachel, in his book, The Southern Hospitality Myth, links Southern hospitality to, you probably know where I'm going with this, roots on the plantation where white hospitality is buttressed on black labor. And he traces the concept of Southern hospitality forward in time, looking at how hospitality was wielded as an exclusionary force before it became sort of more benign and benevolent. The concept that we sort of think we know when think we know about today. When we talk about Southern hospitality. But the thing that his project and so much work, and I think good work in foodways and good work in Southern studies does, is it takes something, and this is a quote from Tony Sachel, that is, quote, accepted as an essential and natural cultural attribute of the South, unquote, in his case, Southern hospitality, and looks at it closely, giving us a clear accounting of where it comes from, what it has meant at different points in time, and therefore what it sort of inevitably means, at least in part, today. I bring up this brief example of Southern hospitality, not only because hospitality is easily linked to food, because I think it is, but also because in studying both the origins of Southern food and those of Southern hospitality, we embark on the difficult task of complicating something that, at first blush, seems benign or even positive. Because food itself does not taste like history. In other words, it's possible that the act of consumption can actively cover up the type of cultural history that we explored at our Southern Shabbat and that I have briefly discussed today. And I want us to think about that contrast for a moment. Is there something about enjoying eating and being transported by food, which I think we probably have, that's a pretty common and almost universal experience. Is there something about that actively works against understanding history and against understanding the particulars of how food arrives on our plate, right? Whether are we actually tasting history when we eat? In one sense, we definitely are, right? When we sat down for the Southern Shabbat, we understood what we were doing as historical. We understood where our food came from, how it combined different cultures, why those cultures were combined in the first place, what conditions gave rise to the combinations that we then saw, on our plates. But does that happen without that sort of broader understanding? And that's the work that foodways scholarship can do. Because food itself, as I said, because food itself doesn't taste like history, it's possible that consuming it can kind of work against that mission. If furthermore, beyond that, if studying Jewish Southern foodways is going to be, as historian Rachel Gross argues, if it's going to be something that destabilizes conventional divides between Judaism, the religion, and Jewishness, the culture, and ultimately helps us better understand how cultural forces related to race, religion, and region exert force on one another. If it's going to do all those important things, we have to do more than simply go out to dinner. Someday we will go out to dinner again, hopefully. But instead of just eating, we have to treat the production and consumption of food like other forms of consumption, loaded with just as much political material as a novel, displaying the same discursive power as music. In short, illustrating what and who we value. Okay, thanks for having me. If you have questions about my talk or want to talk more about this, I encourage you to email me. Yeah, thank you.